In small and medium-sized enterprises, it's very common for the owner to be involved in operational management. And in that case, the owner wears three hats. They are the top manager, the owner, and on top of that, they also serve on the board. In my opinion, it's very difficult to maintain that separation.
If the owner is also the chair of the board, then essentially the board will most likely not be very necessary, or it will be very ineffective.
Is it necessary to take such a difficult and stressful step as changing the CEO?
Changing the CEO is probably more like surgery, while bringing in an interim CEO is more like therapy. And before surgery, it's preferable to try therapy.
As long as it's not homeopathy. Very often, the board faces the task of developing a promising CEO.
If his ambitions blind him and he doesn't realize it, then he needs to be replaced.
And who bears the responsibility? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Council of Boards channel with Sergiy Bulavin. Today, our guests are Dmytro Kozlov and Armen Kurginian. Colleagues, welcome everyone. Hi. And today we will discuss the internal challenges that arise in the work of the board, including the issue of the interim CEO. Dmytro, Armen, and I are members of the boards of Ukrainian companies, mostly advisory boards. And indeed, we constantly face internal challenges that arise during the operation of boards. When an owner approaches us with a request to establish a board, and we create the board, but during its operation, there are certain internal challenges. Moreover, Dmytro and I give lectures at Professional Association of Corporate Governance and at the Institute of Corporate Governance. Challenges are actually one of the subtopics that we delve into quite deeply. Okay, there are indeed various challenges related to the fact that, for example, a company may have several owners. Each owner may have their own vision for the development of the business. An owner might take on the role of simultaneously acting as CEO and wanting to join the board, so 3 roles at once. There are other challenges related to management dysfunction and the culture of decision implementation within the company. Let's talk about this now and exchange our thoughts.
Speaking of owners on the board, in all the boards I've participated in, the owners were part of the board. This definitely affects the way the board operates. It especially influences the nature of the relationship with top management. When the owner is on the board and when the decisions made by the board are, one way or another, associated with the owner and very often initiated by them. A particularly difficult case, in my opinion, is when the owner, and this, by the way, is very common in small and medium-sized enterprises, is involved in operational management. Then the owner wears 3 hats, as Sergiy says. They are a top manager, an owner, and on top of that, they also serve on the board. And so maintaining that separation is very difficult, in my opinion. It's objectively hard, and very often owners get confused in these roles, participating in the board as top managers, often assigning tasks to themselves from the board's role. In my opinion, this is a bit of a light version of schizophrenia, when the owner has to clearly distinguish who they are and when, at what moment they are who, and honestly, not everyone manages to do that. That's why one of the common goals of boards, and this is often a goal stated by the owners themselves, is to remove the owner from operational management in such a way that they remain in the roles familiar to them, where they are most productive.
If we're talking about advisory boards, well, classic advisory boards, then indeed there's no point, so to speak, for the owner to participate because they can't give advice to themselves. Well, if they can, then they don't need a board. Right, but at some point we'll talk about a transitional model from an advisory board to a supervisory board. That will be a different situation. But if we're talking about a supervisory board, I completely agree with you.
We've just listed 3 roles and 3 hats. That is, the owner, a board member, and a top manager. And honestly, it's great that we've managed to avoid the situation where the owner is the chair of the board. Because, for example, in the American type of boards, that's very common. The CEO is also the chair of the board. In our case, if the owner is also the chair of the board, then basically the board will most likely not be very necessary at all.
Well, or it will be very ineffective. But we, so to speak, when we talk with someone, we mitigate this. When there's a request to create a board, we make it a condition. We explain that it doesn't really make sense when the owner is the chair of the board.
In my view, this is a question about the very essence of independence, which is the foundation of corporate governance. Because if the owner is the chair of the board, or if the owner influences the board, and the owner can exert pressure, and this is one of the particular skills of an owner, to get what they need, then we can simply lose that independence, and the whole idea of corporate governance, for which boards are created, becomes meaningless. They must be independent, both in terms of the number of independent members and in terms of their subordination, let's put it that way, their work, their decisions. They truly need to be independent. So here, as much as possible, in my opinion, it's necessary to eliminate the owner's influence on final decisions as much as possible. This brings us to the role of the board chair. When there are many owners, the role of the board chair becomes crucial. It's hard to overestimate.
Listen, Armen, that's interesting. What do you think? What's your opinion? It's clear when it comes to the owner, but should it be a skill that board members have to limit that influence, to ensure they are truly independent? What are your thoughts? Is it something that can be developed, or should board members acquire it in some way?
I believe it absolutely must be there because independence has to be defended. And I think it should even be a prerequisite for joining the board of a company when the owner understands the value of an independent opinion. I actually believe that when an owner comes to the idea of having a board, it somehow indicates that the owner is ready to listen to a different perspective and to accept it for consideration. If we're talking about advisory boards, then the owner, in principle, can listen to the board but ultimately make a different decision. That's absolutely normal. But the very moment when the owner feels the need for a board indicates that the owner is ready to listen to other opinions and understands that differing viewpoints, especially when they are independent, meaning not influenced by collaboration with the owner, receiving some compensation, or having their future somehow tied to the owner, are valuable, specifically with this owner and this company. At the very moment when the owner comes to this realization, and he, one could say, understands the value of the board as a source of independent opinions on company matters.
And I think a lot depends on the ratio of dependent to independent board members. I have experience when I was the chair of the board, and besides me, there were 3 other board members, and all 3 were co-owners and dependent. And accordingly, this was for the chair of the board. A very stressful situation because it was constantly necessary to try to align all decisions and all the work. All thoughts had to be brought to an independent perspective, and that's very difficult. When additional independent members appeared on the board, first one, then another, and there was a balance of 3 dependent and 3 independent members, it worked very well. But when there's 1 independent and 3 dependent members, it's a very difficult situation, especially when the 1 independent member is in the role of board chair, who has to ensure effective discussion among board members. That is the independent part of his energy. During such a meeting is spent on facilitating the discussion, and accordingly, there's less energy left for actually expressing an independent viewpoint. Well, yes, I agree.
Colleagues, let's maybe talk more about the challenges faced by a newly established board. For example, as we often see such management dysfunction or execution failures, this is a situation where the board, together with the owners and even with top management, can plan something, allocate responsibilities, create an action plan that chronically fails to be implemented. And this, it seems to me, also touches on the relationship with top management because it is essentially built around some kind of task plan, which, if there are problems in the internal culture with execution or with the number of people or with the expertise of those people, then very often this can worsen not only the execution of the strategic or tactical plan, but also the relationship with top management, and those are critically important for the board's work. What do you think?
I agree with you because my experience shows that if we're talking, for example, about small and medium-sized businesses, in all the cases where I was on boards or helped to create boards, there really was. Sergiy and I used to call such a person a promising CEO or promising management. He's good, he operates at the level the company was functioning at. The owner had a request to create a board. This doesn't happen for no reason. It's unusual, and it means there are strategic goals ahead. They are ambitious, long-term strategic initiatives. And we come to the realization that the current CEO lacks the expertise or competence needed to achieve the strategic goals. And then the question arises, what should be done?
I would also like to add that from time to time we talk about professional deformation, and we mention it more and more often during the time when the current CEO or a recently former CEO becomes a member of the board. This somewhat interferes at the beginning with working in the board format, that is, focusing on strategic thinking rather than making decisions for top management, even though top management often tries to delegate their decision-making responsibility upward. But perhaps the same issue is related to management dysfunction when the owners are also the managers, for example. They have a kind of professional bias, either as owners or as entrepreneurs, and they try to manage the company like top managers, but in the style of an entrepreneur or owner. And of course, that can't work effectively.
As a comment, I really like this analogy they use, what they call seagull management. Like a seagull swoops in, scatters everything around. And in a company, there are these bursts of energy, because this type definitely works. It's someone who energizes others. But consistent tactical management requires some kind of routine, structure. Structure, yes, exactly.
If I may add, when the owner is involved in operational activities, we understand that it prevents them from rising above those activities and looking at it from a higher perspective. What's wrong with my business? Where do I want to go? They simply don't have the time or the capacity.
Well, yes, and ideally the board could help the owner, if there is such a request, of course, to move up to the strategic level. All theoretical matters should be handled at the level of the company's management structure. That is, if it's necessary to train personnel who can take over the role the owner played in operational management, allowing the owner to work at the strategic level. The question arises, as Dmytro said, a prospective CEO. Yes, Dmytro and I specifically came up with this term so that we wouldn't offend CIOs who are indeed promising. They can become full-fledged CIOs. But at the initial stage when the board is being formed, they are not yet fully capable. So they lack the necessary expertise, experience, management skills, or the ability to use management tools.
And in my opinion, this often happens in small and medium-sized companies where the CEO is a trusted person of the owner. That is, it means that the owner is not so much looking at how professionally suited this person is for the role of CEO, but rather at whether this person can be trusted. Maybe they have shared experience or some family ties or something else. And a situation arises where formally there's a CEO, but the board comes in and sees that this is not yet a true CEO, a fully fledged one. It might not make sense to replace him right away, because he has potential and promise. At the same time, the owner still needs to have trust in the person acting as CEO. Very often, owners are afraid to bring in someone from the outside to entrust their business and step up to a strategic level. That's why the board indeed oftentimes faces the challenging task of developing a promising CEO.
It doesn't always work out. Armen, we know that you have a very interesting experience as an interim CEO, although, as we discussed separately, it's not exactly interim, right?
Yes, it's not exactly interim. Interim, in the global science of management, is more like an interim CEO. It's a person who temporarily joins a company. That is, they are the sole CEO, but everyone understands that they are there temporarily for a certain period of the company's operations. By the way, this is actually very often a transformational period, where a CEO is brought in, possibly with experience in risk management or with specific competencies, who is supposed to lead the company through a certain phase. In my personal experience under an interim CEO, we understood the role as that of a board member who joins the board along with the entire team, but receives a task or additional responsibility to collaborate with the existing CEO. And I personally see it as, in a sense, helping to bring them up to speed, to teach them, including as a mentor, but also to verify how promising this promising candidate really is. There is potential, yes, it may be there, but how attainable is it within the time frame the company needs? In other words, can we afford to wait until this potential is realized so that the company doesn't die before that happens? And yes, I've had several such experiences in different companies. It's an interesting experience, and it's also one of the functions, perhaps a function of the board at the entry stage, when it's necessary to determine whether the company can move forward with the current CEO in whom the owner already has trust, or whether it's necessary to take such a difficult and stressful step as changing the CEO.
Replacing the CEO is probably more like surgery, while an interim CEO is more like therapy. It's preferable to try therapy before going into surgery.
The main thing is that it's not homeopathy. Well, if you believe in homeopathy or not.
Okay, so once again, there is a promising CEO who, according to the board's assessment, could potentially become a full-fledged CEO over time, with some support from a mentor or a coach. At the same time, there is a promising CEO, and additionally, the company brings in an interim CEO. How can this structure function effectively? From the board's perspective, for example, who does the board communicate with? With the interim CEO or with the current CEO in development?
My position is that the CEO or this potential CEO must not lose their authority and reputation. He communicates with the board, he communicates with the employees, but the interim CEO has the experience that is based on practical examples, meaning examples of how communication with teams is built, what tools are used, how decisions are made. This is a very important block. Based on what? With the involvement of someone's opinions or analytics or competitor examples or something else. In other words, how the CEO makes decisions. This, in fact, I think is the most important thing that distinguishes a potential CEO from a CEO who has already established themselves. It's how they make decisions. This can possibly be gained through experience, but the very idea of an interim CEO is to, through specific real-life examples of how a CEO and the company operate today, try to help, support, or accompany the CEO in real life, that is, through real current examples of their work, in order to give him or her an understanding of the actual if you can put it that way, the actual algorithm of actions in various situations. So in a sense, it might look like, like the Chinese, if I'm not mistaken, have a metaphor like this. When a plant is growing, and if you pull on it too hard, it's more likely that it won't grow. In a sense, it might look like that, but that's exactly why I add that it's not only about pulling or forcing grow, it's also about verifying whether, in principle, if we stick with the same example, the soil is fertile. Is the plant being watered? Can it grow with this amount of sunlight and so on? This is exactly what one of the board members can take a closer look at. We started calling it Interim SEO. There can be different opinions on how accurate that term is. That's right, but it works, and it can also be used during the initial stage of the board's involvement.
The interim SEO came in, worked for, say, 6 months. Okay, good, there's potential. In another 5 years, it will be excellent. But we understand that it doesn't really work that way. So maybe we don't need to drag him along, but we do need him to very quickly gain the expertise he lacks, the skills he doesn't have. As far as I understand, when you were in the interview with him, you had the chance to see, okay, he's learning, he's listening. And if not, what should we do next?
If not, then in my opinion, it's not just a possibility, but an obligation of a board member who performs these functions to report this to the board and raise the question of whether we can keep spending time, whether we can keep looking for different approaches and justifications for why it's not working right now. But the board's opinion is that the CEO needs to be replaced.
All right, that's when he doesn't listen, but what if he does listen and you see that progress is just very slow and it will take a few more years?
I think it depends on the challenges the company is facing. If the company needs to transform quickly, or for example, the company is in such a stressful state, there are major risks, and we can't afford to take chances and wait another 5 to 7 years until the CEO grows into the role. Either you need to support them with strong managers, but we know that strong managers won't work under a weak CEO, or if they do, they won't stay long. Or you need to replace the CEO and bring in a strong one who can either unlock the potential of the existing team or bring in their own team. So I believe, if, roughly speaking, if the MRI shows, and this work with the interim is in a sense that kind of analysis, that surgery is needed, then surgery must be done. Well, yes, I agree.
Okay, Armen, you're saying that if the interim CEO came from the board, that is, a board member temporarily became the interim CEO, but you also had the experience of being in the board yourself and then becoming the interim CEO for a while, and another experience when you weren't on the board but became the interim CEO. Does that affect communication with the board?
Yes, it definitely affects it because the communication between someone outside the board and someone inside the board obviously influences how the relationships play out. Why? Because a person who is on the board understands the background of certain things better. The board's decisions, the board's questions, the board's focus, which highlight different areas. Because of the board, thanks to this dialogue, which lies at the heart of corporate governance, it arrives at certain questions, conclusions, actions, and so on. If a person is separated from the board, they don't see this part. They only see the decisions. That is, they don't see how the decision was reached, but only the final tasks. For example, those passed down to the CEO.
Another question, probably for both of you, because when we discussed the previous questions, you mentioned that the CEO retains authority, there's no issue with authority, but who holds the responsibility?
If the CEO retains the same authority and responsibilities to make those other decisions, then the responsibility remains there. SEO on existing potential SEO as it was before. If on certain issues the board decides that they must be, for example, verified by the interim CEO, if these are critical business matters, then the responsibility would lie jointly or solely with the interim CEO. That's also a possible scenario. Next is the question of responsibility of the board. That is, if the board sets certain tasks and chooses the tools for their implementation or proposes tools for implementation, then if we're talking about the supervisory board or the transitional board, then the question of responsibility may also arise. So I would say it's a case-by-case basis.
Well, yes, I agree with Armen here. If it's shadow support, as we said at the beginning, then both the authority and responsibility should remain with the current CEO. We haven't had such a case, at least I haven't, but if, for example, we change the picture, we realize there's some potential there, but we also understand that even for the current matters or decisions, there's a lack of competence and so on. Then it might make sense to bring in an interim CEO who takes over the responsibility and the current CEO becomes a shadow to our new CEO for a certain period of time and learns in the process of working. And then the authority and responsibilities are already with this new interim CEO, while the other one is learning, in order to catch up and reach the required level. And then gradually the authority from the interim is handed back.
There has to be one leader for the team. There can't be two pack leaders, there can't be two presidents. There can be a prime minister and a president, but in principle, any group must have. Evolution has shaped us this way. One strong leader, and here it's very important not to take away part of the power from the existing CEO, because that's not the goal, but he and the team might think that this is exactly the task. That's why it's very important here. This is to separate, and actually, well, it's not an obvious task.
I think it's very important that the prospective CEO understands that this is for his own benefit. If his ambitions blind him, if he doesn't understand this, he needs to be replaced. Nothing will work out. We have an example like that, where in the end we did end up making such a change. By the way, Roman, a question for you and for Sergiy. We've talked about the prospective CEO, we've discussed what an interim CEO is, although Roman said it's not quite the right term. But what do you think, what qualities should this interim have, CEO? Because we understand that not every CEO will be suitable for this role.
It seems to me that first and foremost it's a support function, meaning a function of guidance, or rather a skill of guidance, a skill of teaching, transferring experience, transferring knowledge, first and foremost. And at the same time, this person should not seek any share of power within the CEO role. That is, as I said, they should avoid pulling the blanket over themselves, because that puts at risk the reputation and the potential of this promising CEO to fulfill their function if they are overshadowed. Then with this team, because the team needs a leader, and it has to be confident in them.
Should the mentor have this kind of profile? Yes. Sergiy, what do you think?
We've already touched a bit on the professional distortions of a CEO, and of course this family, which can be interesting. It cannot have these professional distortions.
I agree, but colleagues, it turns out that the task lies with the board. We conducted the first interview, we created a board taxi. We understand that this is a promising taxi CEO, and we know about this tool, the CEO interview. We understand that this is the best option to offer, to help them grow. But such people with these skills are not always available on the board. What do you think? Is it possible to bring in such a person from outside as a board taxi?
I think it's possible, but it would be more effective if this person served as a bridge between the board and the team, and also with the CEO as an additional function, because the relationship between the board and the team is very important for execution, so this person could additionally act as a bridge between the board and the team. And in this case, it would be very helpful if they were a member of the board. But yes, this person could also come from outside. Yes, indeed, that could also have an effect.
And considering that this person needs to understand how the board works, how the CEO operates, and how one can be a mentor, in fact, for a promising CEO, I believe that this person, if not a member of the board of the company where the promising CEO is, should be someone with experience serving on boards.
I would add that this person needs to understand the perspective from which a board, any given board, views things, not necessarily directly, but in general how an independent board views the team, what the expectations are.
And of course, communication between the board and management, between the board and the owner or owners is very important, starting from the moment the board is created. Dmytro, as you and I have explained during our sessions at PEAC and the Institute of Experimental Management, it's very important that the owner, before the board actually begins to operate, is able to properly inform the company's top management about the creation of the board. Why is this necessary? Who are they? What is expected? And further, so that the board can communicate, including communicating in a structured way. That is, from time to time, the board should describe to top management the tasks that lie ahead of the board for a certain period of time. From time to time, the board didn't report, but rather informed top management as best it could about what had been done, what hadn't been completed, what was postponed to another time, and provided convenient communication.
No, I support that. By the way, in the boards where we are together, right, colleagues, that's exactly what we do. We come in, we work on the board's goals for the near term. And I agree, perhaps we should communicate so that our expectations are aligned, so that management understands. And then, after a certain period, once a year, what has been accomplished, which goals were achieved or not. I'm sure it's also important to communicate that.
I believe that, especially at the initial stage, like on a first date, the way the board starts working with the team, the way it communicates, not just the fact of communication itself, but specifically how it communicates its presence, its functions, how it, so to speak, sells itself to the team, and how the team, in turn, also earns its place. You need to sell not only to the owner, who makes the decision about whether or not to create a board. This directly affects how effective the board will be, because the board can be bursting with ideas and, to put it bluntly, create a super strategic plan, but if the team doesn't have that response, that feedback from the team, effective feedback from the team to what the board produces, then there will be no progress. And this is actually very difficult. I have to say, I don't know how much this fits into the format of this discussion, but we don't always manage to sell ourselves as effectively as possible to the team, because the board, one way or another, cannot be stripped of its controlling function. It's important. This is not its primary function, but it is still there. And the team very often perceives the board as just another controlling body. Will be that way in any case, but it's important that the additional help or support the board provides is accompanied by, so that top management has the ability to assess it, so that the board provides the team with exactly what is needed. For example, breaking static perspectives, offering additional connections, expertise, testing, hypotheses, and so on, so that the team, especially top management, if we're talking about the team, can evaluate the board's work and the added value the board creates. That is, it's not only for the owner, but also to ensure the team is effective in addressing the tasks set by the board.
Well, and some owners, before implementing a board, they send their top managers for training related to the board, so that top management better understands how the board works, what can be expected from it, and how to collaborate with it.
And I'll add something here. Yes, this is more of a trust-based thing. We're talking about top management and their expectations, but there's also such a thing as no one understands the specifics of the business better than top management, especially when the board comes in. And that's why the board is also interested in engaging top management as quickly as possible, because it helps the board understand the specifics of the business more quickly. For them, I mean top management, it's an opportunity to prove themselves and realize their potential. Well, as for the controls, they get used to them
over time. But it's a tough process because the board is waiting. It adds work. It adds work, yes. And it's justified because the owner and the board see that something needs to be done differently.
I agree.
But the team perceives it differently.
Well, but come on, this is work. There's simply more work now. And if we're talking about our experience, we formulate strategic goals, we work on the strategy together with top management. And top management, if everyone is reasonable, understands that, okay, now we have a strategic goal. In 10 years, we want to be, say, X50. And then, yes, I think it becomes emotionally easier, meaning we're no longer working in the same mode as before joining the board. And the board is there to help achieve these goals. Everything has changed. New goals, a new approach, and their expertise is truly very important.
All right, Armen, Dmytro, thank you for a very interesting discussion and exchange of ideas.
Thank you, Dmytro.
Let's now do a summary for our viewers. So there are challenges regardless of how prepared the owner is. No matter how prepared the company is or how ready the top management is, there are always challenges when implementing a board. Both the board and the owner need to be aware of this, and they need to know how these challenges can be addressed. One of the challenges that we discussed in more depth than the others is a promising CEO, that is, a CEO currently working in the company who has the potential to grow into a fully capable CEO, but at the moment lacks full expertise or the necessary skills to be fully effective. A CEO. And as a way to address this challenge, we discussed the concept of an interim CEO, that is, a CEO who is brought into the company for a certain period of time. In order to help the promising CEO grow into a fully capable one, a CEO.
We also discussed what qualities this interim CEO should possess. CEO, and also how important communication is among everyone, among all the actors.
The actors, yes, all the structures. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. See you in the next episodes.